Hello, everyone. My name is Lasagna Scott. I'm a business development manager for two services at AWS Service Catalog and AWS Control Tower. And I also have with me today Sid Gupta, who's the principal product manager for AWS Config. And we're honored to have Brian Slater, who's the head of technology architecture for Legg Mason, a financial services company. So we're going to get started with our presentation today on how to ensure configuration compliance. Our agenda, we're going to talk about some challenges, and some of those challenges may be familiar with you all. We'll talk about a best practice to addressing configuration compliance. And when we say configuration compliance, we're talking about infrastructure as code. And then we're going to give, Brian's going to come up here and tell you how Legg Mason addresses configuration compliance, and then we'll wrap it up. We do have some related sessions regarding governance, and feel free to take a picture of that slide throughout this week at reInvent. And I'll pause for just a minute so I see some cameras up. All right, let's get started. Let's talk about some challenges. So if anybody's ever been on a Tiger team, and I'm sure some people in here are, as you were going on your cloud journey, you're excited about moving to the cloud, you had a particular workload, you saw the opportunity for speed and agility, and you were ready to expand this and move forward. And then here come the regulators, I'll call them. Your compliance team, your security team, they weren't aware of what was going on. They wanted to see, prove to me that this is going to be consistent, secure. What is your approach? How many people have had that situation? Don't raise your hands, blink, because you might be sitting next to somebody in compliance or security. But the whole premise of that is, how do you address that when builders want to move fast, innovate, be creative, but your cloud teams or your IT teams or even your governance, whoever that may be, want to make sure that you mitigate the risk, protect your brand, and also conform to all the compliance needs that your company has. So typical compliance challenges is, how do we address compliance, especially as we're moving to infrastructure as code? We're changing now from hardware racks and stacks. How do you address infrastructure as code? We know about how to do it in the software world, but how do we do it at this level? How do you educate your stakeholders? We recommend proactively getting your security and your compliance teams involved, helping them understand how this process works. How do you embed those standards into as you introduce new technologies and services into your organization? And then how do you report the findings as you're getting audited? And how do you even educate your auditors on how we're transitioning to infrastructure as code? Because some may or may not be aware of that. So we're going to move to best practices. And what I want to say is that with AWS Management and Governance tools, you can have both agility and governance at the same time, leveraging these native services. If you guys don't remember anything I said, if you ate a big breakfast and you're a little tired, just remember this. The way to establish that governance is pre-configure compliance into your cloud designs. Provide that proof to your compliance and your security teams so that you have consistent delivery patterns and people feel more secure that what you're doing is predictable. So from a best practice approach, we're going to talk about 4 areas, and then we're going to have this theme of detective and preventive controls. And you'll hear that through Sid, myself, as well as Brian today. So establish your standards. Remember where you start from in your other journeys prior to the cloud. Align your standards to your industry, your regulatory, your company policies. Design your configurations. We recommend that you do templates so that you can have that consistent delivery. Launch your products in a predictable manner, and we'll talk about that and talk about 2 services that can enable that. And then ultimately, so you've done all this innovation, you've met your standards, But then you also have to figure out a way to manage and mitigate and remediate issues as you're moving your workloads to the cloud. So let's talk about establishing the standards. First thing you have to do is align what are your key requirements for configurations and how much security, compliance, how much governance is needed for each environment that you have. If you set that up first, then it starts that chain of predictable delivery for your environment, for your workloads. Once you've established those standards, then you have to go to designing your configurations. And when I talk about designing the configurations, I'm focusing on what does it mean for, I've got this example of a full application stack. So at that top layer, there's your software, your code repositories. But if we're going to focus today on that cloud service configuration, what are your service templates? What model do you have for every different type of workload? How are you creating those service templates to be consistent and then give the agility through parameters? What are your configurations for security? What kind of resources are going to be in your workloads? What processes are you going through? And then operational metadata, we also know that as tags. How are you consistently delivering your resources and tagging them, and your tagging strategies provides more details and information. So from a design perspective, you have to make sure that your configurations are immutable. And some people are like, immutable, unchanging, consistent, aligning those to your configuration environment. So that one slide I had above where I talked about each different environment, enabling detective controls for it, such as config rules, and then also enabling auditing and reporting for your different workloads. We're moving from establishing the standards, designing the configurations. Now it's time for us to start moving things into the cloud environment, your resources. So AWS CloudFormation is our orchestration tool that allows you to, through soft infrastructure as code, to launch resources into the AWS environment. We also have AWS Service Catalog, which is a proxy to CloudFormation. And what we do is we separate the permissions of the resources to the end user that's requesting them. So what happens is the end user has access to products that they can provision, and the resource permissions are put on launch constraints that allows those products to provision, and Service Catalog as a service invokes those products and provisions them. From a configuration enablement perspective, what our service does is tag options, and I also call them standardized tags. So if you have a product, which is basically a CloudFormation template, you can put tags, standardized tags, called tag options, that allow every time that product is invoked for those tags to consistently be on those products. We also give you the ability to put values for different key tags, and so then you can give your end users choices, and you'll see this in an upcoming demo of which type of tag value to select. We also enable stack sets, where you can provision a product to multiple accounts or multiple regions, as long as there's a trust relationship between those products. And finally, we know that a lot of customers have enterprise service management tools or ITSM tools. So what we've done is we've also developed connectors to ServiceNow, as well as recently launched Atlassian Jira Service Desk, to allow you to provision products in their catalogs or request mechanisms, and those products then provision AWS resources into our platform. So, like I was saying before, you embed the configuration compliance through that product. You put your permissions, your parameters, and we only expose those parameters and versions of the products to the end users. And then you can organize your products into what we call portfolios. And in some ITSM tools, they call them categories. And then from that, those launch constraints allow the end users to then request those products. So the products can either be requested through the console. The majority of customers use us from a command line experience, and now we have 2 ITSM connectors that allows customers to provision them from there. So what I'm going to do is I've created a demo to show you how, from a preventive control, doing those provisioning, and then we're going to also show you some post-operational actions. So in my demo, you'll see here this architecture diagram that shows that there's a connection between Atlassian Jira Service Desk and AWS Service Catalog. We stay the source of truth, and then what we're going to do is order an EC2 instance. So here is the control help center for Atlassian Jira Service Desk. And I've just asked for, I need a server for my latest app. I'm going to look at different products, and I'm going to select the web server one. I'll see where that product and portfolio and what region it's going to be provisioned in. I'm going to give it a unique product reference name, and then I'm going to select which version of the product that I want to provision. I'll input my parameters, and I want to select a T2 medium instance. Remember I was talking about those tag options and that you could do choices? So for my cost center, I automatically put the choice in that I want, and then I've hit create, and now what we're doing, in this tool, you can do approvals as well. So I automatically did as an administrator, I know normally, a different person is the approver, showed you how you could approve that request, and now it's launching. We put in the request parameters, and then we show the product events. We already have information pulling into Jira Service Desk of that product. So now I'm taking you into EC2 console, and I'm showing you that that product is initializing. And then I want to show you how that 1893 tab for the cost center, all those different tags were automatically placed on that EC2 instance. So now what we're going to do is show how some of that's done through AWS Service Catalog, is that you compile your products through a portfolio. I'm showing the web server product. We do have a feature with budgets to view those. And then I'm going to click on the LAMP Stack 3 that I requested. And I'm showing you that not only do we have the CloudFormation template, but you just saw post-operational actions for an EC2. So you have the ability, once it's provisioned, to stop or start an EC2 instance. So in Service Catalog, we also place the provision product details, make that available. We're back in Jira Service Desk. It's showing that it succeeded. So we're going to pull and come back and let people know that this did happen correctly. Now what I'm doing is going to a previous request, showing that that product was available in Jira Service Desk. And now I have the ability to request an update, a terminate, or I could do a self-service action on that product. And so what I'm going to do is that M1 on the previous product that I provisioned, that's too much compute. I don't need that. So I'm going to update it and change it. And as you can see, it's going to start to update that instance and bring it down to a T2 family. And I also just got a notification that my previous request is now available in Jira Service Desk. So from a provisioning and perspective, this is what's available and can help with the configuration compliance. Now I'm going to turn it over to Sid, who's going to talk about detective controls.
Thanks, Masonia. Hello, everyone. My name is Sid Gupta. I'm a principal product manager at AWS, and I'll be talking a bit about managing your resources once the resources have been provisioned. So you heard from Masonia how preventative controls are necessary in your environment to ensure that resources are not misconfigured prior to provisioning of those resources. So oftentimes, you may come across situations where configuration changes are made out of band. Now, this could be either through the AWS console, like outside of Service Catalog, or it could be through APIs. Now, in such situations, we recommend having detective controls in place. So as a best practice, you should have both preventative and detective controls in your environment to make sure that your resources are compliant with your internal guidelines, policies, and best practices. So some of the things that you need to answer using these detective checks is, are your resources configured based on best practices? And do they comply with your internal policies or maybe regulatory policies that are dictated by PCI or HIPAA? So for these reasons, in order to effectively implement a detective control, you need to know a few things. Things such as, what resources exist in my account? What is the current configuration state of those resources? And what was the configuration state at any point in time in the past? How are my resources related to each other? And finally, what are the resources that violated my policies? So in short, you need a real-time configuration auditor in the cloud. Now, the key word here is real-time, because as you may know, resources in the cloud are very dynamic. You've got things like auto-scaling mechanisms, spot instances, where your resources come and go within a matter of minutes. But it's important to make sure that even for that short amount of time, your resources do not violate any policies that you've set. So that's where AWS Config comes in handy. AWS Config is a native agentless service within AWS that can automatically discover the resources in your account. The moment it's turned on, it tracks changes to the configuration of those resources, and it maintains that history for about 7 years by default. And since we're capturing the configuration state of your resources, you can then create policies using config rules that analyzes that configuration based on your requirements. Now, these evaluations occur in real time, and config will alert you through SNS notifications or CloudWatch events whenever a resource violates a particular rule. Lastly, you can also integrate AWS Config with your own investments in ITSM tools, such as ServiceNow or any other tool that you have in the market. I'm super excited to talk about some of our recent launches in AWS Config. So we launched automatic remediation with config rules earlier this year. Now, this is a feature that allows you to not only detect the changes or the compliance notifications for resources, but also take a corrective action after that. So for example, if you have a config rule that told you that this particular EC2 security group is wide open to the whole world on port 22, you can now have a remediation action that can go and fix that security group automatically triggered the moment it's detected. So as I mentioned earlier, since your resources are dynamic in the cloud, you may have only a few minutes till that resource is alive. But automatic remediation will help you take that corrective action without any manual intervention. Another feature that we launched last week is Conformance packs. So Conformance packs help you package a set of config rules along with remediation actions into a single entity known as a Conformance pack. Now, this entity can be deployed across your entire organization since it's integrated with AWS organizations. So you can do that with a simple click, and it's a really quick way to establish a quick baseline across your entire enterprise. without having to worry about the deployment of each individual rule and the associated remediation action. The pack gets deployed as a whole, so it's intended to simplify your deployment experience at scale. Another benefit of conformance packs is that from a reporting perspective, now you can get compliance summaries at the pack level, and then you can drill down to get more details at the rules or the resource level. The third benefit of conformance packs is that they're immutable, meaning if they have been deployed from the organization master account, the member accounts or the child accounts cannot modify or delete those packs. So this is especially important from a governance perspective, because oftentimes you have central IT teams or InfoSec teams who want to deploy these governance rules, but those member accounts may end up disabling them or deleting them altogether. The third feature that we launched last week is called custom configuration items. Now, this is a very exciting feature because this allows you to use AWS Config for non-AWS resources. So a good example is a GitHub repository, and you can use a config rule to identify GitHub repositories that are public or private. Another example could be an Active Directory server that may reside on-premise or in any other environment, and you want to govern the configuration of that Active Directory using config rules. So it's really opening up the world, opening up config to the world, so that you can use config as the single tool to audit not just AWS, but also non-AWS resources. So let me go and give you a quick demo on conformance packs. So I can access the conformance packs through the new console or the redesigned console on the AWS config page. So here on the left nav, let me click on conformance packs. So I'll go ahead and deploy a conformance pack. Now, conformance packs uses a YAML template under the covers. So we have a few sample templates available. These are for best practices for various services like DynamoDB, S3, IAM. We even have a conformance pack for PCI DSS. So you can either choose one of these sample templates and modify them according to your needs, or you could create your own template. So I've already downloaded a template for S3 best practices. So this is what the template looks like. It's got all the config rules within that pack, and it's also got the remediation actions associated with each rule. So it's a very familiar format. It's a YAML format that you're familiar with CloudFormation already, so it should be easy to use this template. So I'll go ahead and upload this template. Okay, let me give it a name. And I'll specify the S3 bucket where I want my conformance pack reports to be delivered, and supply any input parameters for the YAML template. So let me go ahead and now deploy this pack in my account. All right, so it's in progress. Let's wait a few seconds. And there you can see that it got deployed. So if I click into the pack, I can see all the config rules within that pack, its remediation status, and the compliance status of each rule. And when I click into the rule, I can see more details about the remediation action associated with the rule, and the resources that are compliant or non-compliant. So let me now go ahead and, yeah. So what I showed you earlier was a conformance pack in a single account. Now imagine a scenario where you're an organization master and you want to deploy this pack across your entire organization. So here's a quick CLI command to do that. So I just deployed a conformance pack in my org. So let's go ahead, and I've got 2 accounts in my org, so I'll go ahead and click on one of the member accounts just to see if that pack got deployed. So you can see the pack got deployed there, and it's non-compliant. I can click on it and get more details about the individual rules within that pack, just like before. So I mentioned earlier about the benefit of immutability. So let me now try to delete this pack. So I'm logged in as a member account, and now let me try to delete it. Let's see what happens. So as you can see, you got an error there, or a message saying that you don't have enough permissions to delete this pack. So really useful from a governance perspective to make sure that your baseline policies don't get tampered with by your member accounts in your organization. All right, so that was a demo on Conformance Pack. Now let me go ahead and give you another demo on the second feature that we launched last week called custom configuration items. So in this demo, I'm going to be tracking the configuration of an Active Directory server, which could be located anywhere. It could be on premises or any other cloud. So let's go ahead. So I'll log in to my Active Directory server, and you can see I've got a few users in there. Let me click on user Sid. So you can see here that the password never expires flag is set to true. Now ideally from a best practice standpoint, you don't want to have such configuration for your Active Directory users. You want your users to keep changing their passwords every few days. So we will use config rules to check or to identify all users who have this flag set to true. Okay. So just to describe the architecture here a little bit, I've got a Lambda function there. It's called an Active Directory config connector, AD config connector, that will basically poll the Active Directory using LDAP polling. It will fetch the configuration of that user and then turn around and write that information into config using our custom CI APIs. Once that information is in config, I can then use config rules, which uses Lambda functions behind the covers to analyze that information and to identify all resources that have that flag, password never expires, set to true. So I've got more information on the Lambda function here, but you can get all of these details through our GitHub repository, so I'll quickly skip through this part. All right. So this is the config console, and this rule or the Lambda function actually runs every minute. So every minute it fetches the Active Directory configuration and sends it to config. So as you can see here, it's identified Sid as the user who's non-compliant for the rule that we set. So as usual, you can get the same timeline for config, where you can see what configuration changes occurred on this user. And then you can also see compliance changes for that user. So this is a timeline for the compliance, where you can see how this user went in and out of compliance across any point in time. So very useful feature if you want to use config as the single tool to govern not just AWS, but any resource out there. It could be any third-party tool, a SaaS tool, GitHub repository, anything that you have there. All you need to do is configure the schema of that custom resource in CloudFormation registry, and then you can start pumping that data into config using our public APIs. So really encourage you to try out these new features in config, and that will really help you ensure configuration compliance in your environment. With that, let me hand it over to Brian, who will talk about the strategies that they use at Legg Mason to ensure configuration compliance.
Thank you, Sid. So hi, my name is Brian Slater. I'm the head of technology architecture at Legg Mason. Just a little bit of a background about the company. We are a financial services company, so we do have a lot of compliance needs and things that we need to get into our environment. We have locations worldwide, so we have a variation of things that we need to always monitor and make sure we're in compliance. And if you can go to the URL and find some more about the company if you're interested there. A little bit about our AWS journey. We were at a managed service provider, and for more of a long-term strategy, we decided to go with AWS. As part of that move, we had to do it in 9 months' time due to some deadlines that we had. We brought on some additional staff, trained up staff as much as we could during that period of time. And where we could take the opportunity, we wanted to make sure we were using enterprise tool sets wherever possible. We didn't want to manage our environments differently in AWS and on-prem. So when we looked at AWS services, we wanted to make sure we were choosing and configuring things as much as possible to leverage those features. And then all of those compliance tasks that were sort of outsourced in the past or another group's responsibility, all of that came back in-house on the team, so we wanted to make sure we definitely delivered that. So just in case you don't know why compliance is important to us, it's all about serving our customers, but also about financial and reputational impacts there. As far as compliance frameworks, we have SOX and 404 audits. We also have compliance needs based on what's called overarching controls. I would kind of summarize those in managing your environment well. Anybody that's managing their environment with best practices and keeping a close eye on it would be meeting those kind of overarching controls. And then a general policy that we wanted to apply to our environment as well is that we didn't want to manage our production environment and non-production environments differently. If it was what we needed in production, we wanted to make sure we applied this exact same rule set to our non-production environment. That way we can move data back and forth without worrying about sanitizing any of the data or that there would be any kind of exposure in our lower environments along the way. So you heard a little bit earlier about going from a preventative and then a detective. I wanted to start off with talking about detective, but it really is an iterative process. You're ever going to have changes in your environment, so you'll never be able to start off with a perfect situation every time. But as you make changes to your environment, you might have new requirements. You can build those into your controls and then roll them back into your provisioning so that as new things are in your environment, you're starting off on the best possible starting point along the way. So our first use case here is around using Systems Manager, and you'll see how that rolls into some of the config and service catalog a little bit later on. But using Systems Manager, we've been able to completely automate our patching process. It was always a hit or miss historically, but since we've started using a systems manager, we've been able to hit those cycles, report on them in a very standard and good way. And if you do have things that you need to do that are out of your patching cycle, whether it be some kind of new vulnerability that's out there or something you need to apply to your environment, you can use the exact same approach that you do for patching your environment for fixing those items. So you can use the systems manager, run commands to do those ad hoc things. And then what's really great about this approach as well, going back to the enterprise tool sets, you can use Systems Manager regardless of operating system. So you're no longer going, oh, this is the best tool for Windows and this is the best tool for Linux, but you can use this tool and it works well for both. And then some of the other benefits that you get out of using the Systems Manager is using the software inventory that comes out of that. Not only can you get it for your patch management and getting inventory of the software on those EC2 resources, you can also leverage that for some license management. It's really great to have an inventory. So if you want to see what versions of software you're running out there, if something new comes out and the new version is vulnerable in some way, you can query your entire environment relatively quickly because you already have the inventory readily available for you, and then assess the risk based on that. And then, as you just saw, you can track software changes as well. And all of this is kind of a groundwork to then move into AWS Config, which we'll get to in just a moment. So just one tip, we were moving quickly. Could have saved ourselves some time, so I just wanted to throw it out there. If you are using SSM to gather your inventory, set that frequency really low so you're not waiting for that to run and rescan your environment and track your changes. If you have it set for one day, you may be waiting a while to see some of your work take effect. When I was talking about the process being automated, what we've done with Systems Manager is we set up maintenance windows. And what you see up on the screen here is two types of maintenance windows. One is a scan maintenance window that will go out very frequently and continually scan all of our resources. So if we need to take action or we want to know what's the most up-to-date software on our systems, we don't have to wait till another day to find out or have that lag behind there. And then we have what is an install action and SSM on the maintenance windows. And those are the ones that actually do the patching for us. So you'll see different patch groups there. We enable them right before we would like to roll them out. This also gives us another level of control of making sure a patching cycle isn't misscheduled in some way and goes out to the environment. One of the other pieces that's really nice that comes out of here that kind of rolls into some of the other things you saw earlier is you get these nice compliance summary reports out of SSM. So if you want to report to your IT organization, everything's been patched and any of your rules, you can extend those out here, but this is just more about the patching piece on this screen here. You can use these as reports you send out for status, or you can save them off as evidence for your compliance team that you did indeed patch the environment and everything was all clear. And then the next use case is really using what we just saw with SSM and starting to leverage it for AWS Config. So there's just up on the board here, there's a list of order of things that we went through. Our approach was using S3 as a repository for all of our installation executables or RPMs. And then in addition to that, you could store your configuration files there or any other items that you need to deploy to the environment. Then we started building up our document repository. This is the SSM document repository, which is really calling those scripts with some additional parameters. You can share those out to other teams to run as an approved thing to do instead of having someone log into a machine and run those scripts manually. This document could be leveraged instead. So you get a consistent installation or approach to that. Then you can leverage those SSM documents to build automation documents, which we'll see in AWS Config later. We decided to not create separate documents doing the same thing. There are different document types. We use the automation documents as a wrapper to call our SSM documents so that we didn't need to maintain two versions that do similar things. Then you can go into building your configuration roles. In this case, we're going to see a simple example, but you could expand this out to any kind of software agents in your environment. This is for installing the software and making sure it's available because you need it for some kind of operational cybersecurity log auditing capability. You want to make sure those things are out there. So we built out the configurations roles to see where we were as far as compliant, non-compliant, which you saw a little bit earlier. Once we detected that and we were comfortable with our automation documents, we could then use the config auto remediate feature, which I'll show you in just a moment, to then automatically correct anything that was not compliant. This has been pretty powerful in our environment to make sure that we're consistent throughout. Then some other things that you'll need to do depending on your AWS environment, how it's set up. If you have a multi-account structure, you'll need to set appropriate roles, and then you'll want to share that central repository of work out to all of your child accounts. So this is really scalable. Once you get something that is operational and ready to go, you can scale that any way you need. And then where it starts adding yet another feature is that you can extend the same process. When I was talking about earlier, having an enterprise approach, you can extend this to your on-premise systems as well. You don't have to manage AWS and on-premise as a different process with a different tool set. Just a quick screenshot here where I was talking about the difference between the two different document types. You'll see on the left there's a command document, which is your standard SSM document, and then the one right next to it is the automation document, which again is just kind of a wrapper of the first document. You need that automation document to be able to use the AWS Config remediation feature. You can't use an SSM document directly, so that's the importance of that automation document. So this is a AWS Config Roll that's looking for software on a system and seeing if it's compliant or not based off of that SSM inventory that I was referring to earlier that was used during the patching process. And you can see at a summary level that the remediation action is set for an automation document. And diving into that configuration role, what you'll see is there is the resources that it's using, that SSM managed instance inventory, is being leveraged yet again. So the AWS config role is using the SSM managed inventory that's collecting on a regular basis, and it's looking for this particular value here, which in this case is the NCPA client. That's the name that it's registered on Linux systems. Just a note there is that even from the same vendor, they may be different on Windows and Linux, so you may need to build out different documents to look for different name sets, even though it's kind of the same software. And once you have the automation documents, they'll be available in the remediation action dropdown. You just select the one that you want to use against this config rule when it's not compliant. And there's some additional parameters there, but once you set that and it's detected as not compliant, it'll go ahead and just call the automation document, which calls your SSM document and goes and grabs all the software and scripts that you have stored in S3. So there's probably a lot better way to do this than when we did it now, especially after probably a lot of the announcements here at this reInvent. But even if you had to take a step back and those features weren't available to you, you can script a lot of this out, leveraging AWS organizations, pulling in those account numbers, using an automated process to share out those documents, because you're always going to either be adding accounts or adding documents, and doing this through the console is not as efficient as scripting some of this out. And one of those other little tips as you're going through this, make sure if you're constantly iterating over your documents or your automation documents that as you make changes, make sure you set the default version to the one you actually want the remediation to run. And then just wrapping up on the AWS config and software. So again, the config rules can comply to your own or apply to your on-premise systems as well. You don't have to manage those differently. You can leverage your ITSM ticketing system if you want. You can integrate it however works best for your organization, and sending tickets, creating tickets for people to take action on. Or in our case, we do create tickets, but they're automatically closed as the remediation kicks in. It'll automatically close the ticket as well, so no interaction is needed there. As you're developing, if you want to test some things out in your low environment, you don't have to hook it into your ITSM tool, or if you don't have one available, you can still use SNS topics to send out notifications to teams. And then really two powerful things that came out of this is that the number of resources and time spent on making sure all the required software is out there to be compliant has been drastically reduced. Once you spend a little time setting up these documents and using AWS Config, your environment magically is always at the right state. And there's not a need for someone always going out and checking manually or finding out that something's not completely compliant, there's something missing in your environment when you need it the most. And then that's where finding the root cause of problems or troubleshooting something has been cut down drastically. Again, you don't go out, you have an incident of some kind, you go out, you want to grab some data, and somebody is new, they didn't know to install that agent, we're going to have to backtrack a little bit, install the agent, collect the logs. You're not starting from that negative spot. You can just go in and know that when an actual incident or something you need to respond to or just troubleshooting, all the information you need is already there, so you can actually work on the problem. And this is just something from a logging and auditing standpoint that's really nice about this, and make sure that you can always answer the question for your compliance team or audit team, is that you have these automation documents that are available. You don't actually have to always use a config rule to call the automation documents. You can execute those ad hoc if you need to. And as you do that as a user, an IAM user, you'll see the first couple lines there is my IAM user actually executing the document manually. And then you'll see a list of the auto remediation actions being triggered against resources as well. So that's always being tracked and logged in your environment, so you know who or what is correcting your environment. And then finally, the use case that you're never going to have it all perfect right up front. So there's always going to be a need, or there's always going to be a need for you to go in and troubleshoot or work on something that hasn't been automated yet, or you don't want to automate because it's a riskier automation task and you're not quite ready for it. So you can always use SSM Sessions Manager to log into the system, allow teams to log in, but you can use the Sessions Manager to record all of the activity that's going on, all the keystrokes in that environment, so you're never losing visibility in what teams are doing on your critical business systems, but allowing some flexibility when you're not completely at either an automation step or you need to do something that's an ad hoc task. And then everything that is outside of the EC2 resource in this case, you'll get the CloudTrail logs that are covering you from an audit trail as well. And this is just a high-level diagram showing that we've centralized all of our S3 that I was referring to earlier, all the installation tasks, all the SSM documents, all the config rules, and then we push those to the child accounts in our AWS environment. So it scales really nicely. And then on the bottom right there, what we've done is used dedicated AWS accounts that are just to manage on-prem systems. That way you get you can treat your on-prem data centers or locations as an AWS account like you would in any other environment, and it gives you some flexibility on not commingling systems, or if you want to separate access across different teams, you can do that, but you're still using the exact same approach, the exact same documents and config roles in each of those environments. And then once you've laid that foundation, now you can get it, whatever stage you're at, you can make sure any new thing that comes into your environment is provisioned correctly, leveraging the same work that you've already put in there for a detective and remediation. So using AWS Service Catalog, you can see just a little snip out of the catalog there. It's calling our SSM documents that we created earlier. So instead of waiting for the resource to be provisioned and then those config rules kick in, then call all the automation to fix it, as the resource being provisioned, you can have the catalog call those SSM documents as it's being provisioned. So you get it right up front and you don't have that window of time where it's not in compliance. And then this is more for internal teams, but because we've gotten this work done, we've gotten all of our best practices and compliance roles, et cetera, all straight, we can now start using our ITSM tool, which is ServiceNow, and we're in a proof of concept stage, but very close to production, where we can now present this out, just like you saw with the Jira help desk. We can present this out to other teams, and we can know that any resources that are being provisioned are following all our compliance rules. And a feature of using that as well is that if you do have drifts within your provision resources, you can see here that you can track any of the, once a resource was actually provisioned and something went off from your original rule set, you're tracking that up front as well for any of the changes that occurred using the drift detection. Just to summarize where this has been from an efficiency standpoint, you can see the different categories there, but all that we covered so far was taking about 5 resources time to do, and we're now down to about 1.5 now that this is done. We're not constantly in a grind of fixing things. We can move on to do more valuable work. And the best part of all this is the conversation now changes with the audit teams, et cetera. So if you got the question, are you compliant? I think so. To I know so. It's a very empowering statement that you can say there and be very confident about it. You don't have the questions of when did that happen? Well, that was sometime between I last checked and now. I can definitely tell you that it happened on Tuesday at this time. And then, well, who or what made that change? If you know some of those other things, well, you no longer have to go see who was logged on and try to do some correlation there. You can answer those questions directly. You know what either the ARN that did it, or you can watch the recorded session and all the actions that took place. And then, along with that, here are all the logs that you have for, and here are the logs for evidence. Thank you very much. Back to Masanya.
Thank you, Brian. So outcomes of ensuring compliance, baking in preventative and detective controls will give you an improvement in operational efficiency, consistent delivery, service template consumption, enhanced customer satisfaction, and at the end of the day, make compliance happy, okay? So from a call to action, if you guys feel free to take a screenshot of this. We've placed in some tiny URLs for various, from AWS Config, our answer to configuration, infrastructure configuration management, AWS Service Catalog, as well as the details within Config on GitHub and the new features that we've recently released. Provide us feedback on these services, and let's work together to get some compliant workloads into your production environments. On behalf of Sid, myself, and Brian, we truly thank you for coming. Thank you very much. And if we have a few minutes for questions, if you have any, or if not, we can conclude. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.